Thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to be joining you from Corvallis, Oregon. I'm Dana Sanchez. I'm the Extension Wildlife Specialist here, and I'm one of many folks nationwide working on voles. And I was invited today to particularly focus on some of the vole species that are famous or infamous for population cycles. And so there's my contact information. I understand that the Extension Foundation will be able to share contact information as well as a PDF version of these slides from today. I'll go ahead and get started. Well, I think I'll get started. There we go. So many of the animals we're going to be talking about today are also known for burrowing, and they not all voles burrow. In fact, not all voles live on the surface of the ground. But I do just want to put in a plug as an ecologist to remind us that burrowing animals are special in that they play so many different roles. Sometimes people call them ecosystem engineers or say that they're providing ecosystem services. But even when they are vexing us, some of that burrowing really does contribute to our soil health, to the hydrology of the area that supports us. They provide habitat and food for many other species. And they do, in fact, play keystone roles in some systems that we know of and likely are unheralded heroes in other ways that we don't yet know about. The picture you see here is from a dear colleague, Dr. Bernadine Strict, who is our blueberry expert here in Oregon for many years. And that's a photo of some gray-tail vole burrows beneath weed mat that had been placed to help those really valuable mature blueberry bushes. So we're all here in a shared context of integrated pest management, and I want to just highlight or come back to some core tactics that we use on the human-wildlife interface, sometimes in appreciation, but often we're in conversation about conflicts. The first step being to anticipate where possible and manage or prevent a problem or conflict from coming about. And that is based on accurate species ID. Then thinking about the animal's ecology, having that accurate species ID, getting to know what it does, essentially how it makes a living, and modifying the habitat so that the area in which we're most invested, whether that's a yard or a schoolyard or a park or a farm, that we can think about ways that are feasible to modify that habitat to reduce how many animals of that problematic species can actually fit and find groceries and make a living in that space. And that's often done by reducing how much food is available to them. And that can take a bunch of different forms, depending again on scale of the geographic size of the area, but also the circumstances. And then thinking about, given that many of the animals that we humans tend to come into conflict with, many of those are prey species, and all of the animals that we're going to talk about today are certainly prey species. How can we help out the natural predators to help eat some more of those animals? Another step can be having known who we are dealing with in terms of the animal species, their interests, shall we say, and their abilities. How could we prevent a conflict from either developing or continuing by blocking the animal's access to the thing that we value? So that's exclusion, blocking entry. Uh, at other times, especially among the animals such as those we're talking about today that have such high reproductive potential, We often need to think about how we can remove the animals, even if that is, whether that is a one-time thing that we need to do before we implement exclusion or protection, or whether annual or seasonal removals to reduce population pressure are necessary. And then I've added one to remind us that quite often coordinating with other human beings, our neighbor land users, can also be very, very important. And as I conclude today, I'm going to be giving us an opportunity, particularly those of us who do research, on the ground management, extension, any of those functions, thinking about how can we in the United States work together to better understand some of these cyclic vole species and their ecology and find some new management and sustainable coexistence practices. Okay, so going back to that first stage of knowing who we're dealing with. I find as an extension specialist, I get asked questions and I often need to slow the conversation down and back up and say, let's make sure we know that it's a vole causing the damage you're describing. Sometimes, particularly in the region in which I live, which is the Willamette Valley on the west side of Oregon, there are a lot of different holes in the ground, and that might be the case for you where you live too. And not all the holes are from voles, and not all of plant damage or ground damage is due to voles, although they certainly hold the capacity to do that. So we often talk with folks here about, can you send me pictures with a nice size to scale, just so that we can get a better idea of who we're actually dealing with. This is a panel from a survey that we have distributed among Willamette Valley farmers up and down the valley across crop systems and types. And one of the first things we do in that survey is to make sure that we're all talking about vole damage. And we offer them that second panel, the not vole damage, with some of the leading suspects that are also found in various parts of the valley that might also be having conflicts with agriculture in this case. So you see a couple gopher mounds towards the top right, molehill, and then some impressive tunneling by California ground squirrels on the bottom right there. Whereas the main block are various signs we use to know that we have voles at work in various agricultural systems. Continuing on that, on the left side here, we see several animals that were captured during a vole management research project that I'll talk about more. And these were all animals trapped at the entrances to burrow system entrances made by gray-tailed voles. And so you see at the top two animals, two gray-tailed voles of obviously different age classes, then a deer mouse, and then unfortunately a shrew. So there are many different species that can take advantage of the structures created and maintained by gray-tailed voles. And it is not unusual at all to have conversations. Many people refer to various vole species as mice, and again, at the early stages of a conversation for management and understanding a situation, it's important to make sure that we have identified what animals are actually at work so that we can be more precise and accurate in understanding how we might mitigate or take apart that conflict and manage more sustainably. I have a picture from that was adapted by colleagues in Washington State, our neighbors to the north, from some CDC information. Another concern in the West, particularly as well as the Southwest, is hantavirus. And it is also not unusual to have people being very concerned because they've read or heard news about hantavirus. It comes up in the news periodically to be concerned, although it's not an endemic issue right now in my state, to help people again slow down the conversation just a little bit to be precise about what species are known to be capable of carrying that and what aren't. And then you'll notice the two, well, we've got three non-native invasive species, the house mouse, the roof rat, and the Norway rat in that figure. So we know from records and accounts that these species reach the Pacific Northwest and have been following humans through their building and moving, creating human habitats and cities and towns. That we've had most of those three species in the Pacific Northwest at least since the 16th century. So it's not unusual to have somebody talk about, I've got a vole problem. There's a lot of social concern or weight or sometimes even shame or avoidance, not wanting to say that there are rats in the yard or on the farm. And so the next nearest animal people reach to explain what they're seeing is voles, because voles are in the news here so much. So again, this is just part of unpacking conversations to really understand is the conflict around voles. Okay, having said that, voles are infamous or famous across most of the northern hemisphere, particularly in agricultural settings. Voles come in several different genera or genus groups. They all fall within the subfamily that includes the lemmings, the voles, and the muskrats. Worldwide, I've got a point here that says there are over 70 vole species. Well, depending on whose system and classification and methods you look, there's some who say that there are at least 70 vole species. Others would argue for closer to 110. We'll let that debate continue apace. I will say that they are clearly very successful ecologically in that they show such a diversity in the habitats they occupy, the vegetation communities, their diets, their ecology, mating systems, behaviors, their natural history. As I mentioned earlier, some burrow, some don't. They do share that they are active year-round, which can be a blessing and a curse, right? When they're causing a problem, we don't get a seasonal break from them so much as things that do hibernate. On the other hand, they're more able to be detected and treated if they're active year-round. And the reason we're all here is that some of those species are noted and have been noted for their severe population cycles. Some people call those booms and busts. Sometimes they're called eruptions, spelled with an I. Plague is sometimes a word that is used with regards to the population increases of vole species. And you see on the right here the cover picture of a volume that's about 2.5 inches thick. It was published in 1985 just on the New World microtus. And we are still learning. When I say that voles have been vexing people, especially in agriculture, for a long time, I'm going to posit to you that even Socrates wrote about voles and wondered how in the world do they reproduce the way they do. So across the United States, because I know some of you are joining us from far away from Oregon, there are quite a few species, but some are probably the ones that are most often in conversations about vole conflicts. Those include the meadow vole, the prairie vole, the pine vole, and the California vole. In Oregon, we have 13 vole species that we know of. But again, even within the microcosm of Oregon, our species are remarkably diverse in their ecology. You see a picture here from Dr. DeStefano of a red-backed tree vole. Those little guys don't come out of the canopy of the tree, except by some rare unfortunate accidents. Sometimes there's a little traffic jam up there, and then they'll climb right back up the tree. So they spend their lives, their whole life cycles in the forest canopy. We have several species within the state of Oregon with which we are very unfamiliar with their even basics of natural history. They are seldom trapped, and frankly, there is not a lot of social, economic uh, interest in learning more about them. So they remain somewhat mysterious. But the animal that brought me into working in voles is the gray-tailed vole. And it is endemic. It evolved in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And it is one of those species that is famous for its population cycles. Oregon has other cycling vole species that are also implicated quite often in agricultural conflicts, some of them quite famous. At the bottom, you see the montane vole is known to cycle, and it was, in fact, the subject of both a scholarly work as well as some natural history writing that was written about by a rancher named Dayton Hyde. He and his wife, Gerda, are, in fact, noted alumni of Oregon State University, and he wrote years and years ago about a mouse outbreak or the mouse plague that he observed as a young man, one of his first seasons on the family ranch in Chiloquin. And so if you haven't read Don Quixote and you enjoy natural history writing as well as are interested in voles, you might want to check that out. So I mentioned that Socrates talked about voles. He hypothesized that the explanation for these incredible booms in populations of voles might be because females are born pregnant. So if that doesn't help you understand that human beings have been vexed by voles and just what the heck is going on with their reproduction for a long time, hopefully that helps make the point. It also helps to reflect that although we're all going to continue learning more and working together to find sustainable management, and like I said, coexistence or persistent solutions where we live, that there will be no one and done quote solution. These animals are uniquely built to be highly responsive to favorable conditions such that they can essentially begin producing offspring much faster than any group of predators can possibly eat them. In Europe, voles and lemmings peak at about 3 to 5 years at densities ranging anywhere between 100 and 600 animals per hectare, which somebody actually calculated could come out to a third to almost 2 tons per square kilometer. That's a lot of voles. So I have a figure in this upper right from a paper colleagues in Northern Europe published, and I'm borrowing it here because it's so helpful to think about how the population cycle of these species spans numerous years, and it has multiple phases. So I call it boom, bust, simmer, but you can see how the density of animals, which translates into abundance of animals on the landscape per unit area, goes through multiple changes. Here in Western Oregon, my colleagues and mentors built some replicated enclosures and were able to track very closely the numbers of animals through part of a phase. But I want you to know that this graph on the lower right comes from a low in the population. But even within that, after a crash, there's quite a bit of variability. One thing that they noted that I noted as a potential opportunity for we who try to manage voles or manage around voles is that at least among the gray-tailed vole females, there were none captured in the dead of winter, January and February, that were in breeding condition. So that could offer an opportunity to plan removals when every animal removed is a prospective breeder and to therefore have some greater impact. Now, having said that, the worst possible time to try to get onto the fields in the very wet. We're very blessed with ample rain and snow here in the Willamette Valley. The very worst time to try to get out on fields, as you can imagine, is January and February. So that poses a logistical feasibility issue, even with this clue as to one opportunity for management. So let me say a little bit more about the gray-tailed vole because I think they offer a great example of why managing these animals as they rise towards a peak in populations is so challenging. So the individual gray-tailed vole really doesn't live very long. She might live 2 to maybe 16 months out in the wild. However, given that she can have multiple litters each year and her gestation, her pregnancy lasts about 3 weeks, and that her daughters can, they don't always as a rule, but they are capable of reaching their own sexual maturity at 3 weeks of age. In the meantime, mom, as well as grandma, as well as aunts and older sisters, are all reproducing at the same time. And thus, the power of overlapping reproductive generations is how these animals can maximize. They can put their foot on the accelerator so fast once that combination of factors allows them to essentially escape the carrying capacity of the area in which they're living. So you've already seen the picture of the holes underneath the weed mat in the blueberries. The lower right picture by my colleagues is an example of a path, just one of the paths or runways between burrow entrances that we observed in a very heavily vegetated dairy pasture. We pulled the grass back so that we could see the floor and the path of that passage quite well. You can imagine how with overstory, these animals, even though everything else beside voles is looking to eat voles, that overstory can produce a really great opportunity to safely pass among the safe burrow entrances. Okay, so just a quick reminder again of some of the steps and considerations we use, the potential options and paths to management we think of in IPM with regards to any critter, but including these voles. So for many animals, if we have a carrying capacity that is supporting more animals than we can tolerate, one of the first steps would be to think about how can we reduce the amount of food available. We should be thinking about that possibility. This is not necessarily a great possibility or even one that we can imagine in an agricultural setting, but certainly in our yards and gardens, if we have a grass-eating vole such as gray-tailed vole, and we have planted a lawn, if we reduce the amount of lawn area, we bring that number of animals that can be supported, the initial carrying capacity, down through management. And then if we reduce the number of animals through trapping or lethal baiting, we can uh, bring the animals down to some lower level. Now, this is not accounting for the cycles of voles. This is much more based on the theory of something that doesn't cycle. But it's just really good to visualize the fact that trapping only or removal only can't break the cycle unless we think about what is supporting those animals. So talked about not just reducing their preferred food, but perhaps selecting plants such as native grasses that have evolved with that form of herbivory and that can sustain themselves, can survive essentially with some herbivore removal without completely being eaten to the dirt. With some vole species, and certainly most rodent species, reducing subsidies such as non-vegetation, the spilled bird food, or the downed fruit, or other subsidies that they might use for food, but also cover. So I talked about that overstory of vegetation, making the world a little safer to eat your snack. So we can think about that. We can also think about blocking access. You see an unvegetated strip near an egg building there at the top left. And then some potential solutions. Yes, fencing below the fence if we are being vexed in our yards and at limited scales, obviously, by things that burrow, such as the gray-tailed vole. Can we simply keep them from getting to the area or to the individual plant that they've been girdling, eating the roots of, or eating the herbaceous material from? And then we talked about uh, needing to reduce the population, removing animals from the population. And I have this silly slide and picture in here because many of the folks I get to talk to, of course, they love animals. They're fascinated with wildlife. They want to care for the environment. They want to do the right thing. And just killing animals doesn't feel very good to them about finding a better solution. And so I have an awful lot of conversations throughout the year and across species, from non-native invasive rats to tree squirrels to voles to you name it, about what's the best way for me to move this animal so I can kindly move it to somebody else's property. And I want to tell you, and maybe communicate this to your own stakeholders, that that's really not the kindest option because frankly, animals that get translocated survive at fairly low rates, and the animals in the resident populations are not going to appreciate someone getting dropped into their home range or territory. They don't know where to hide. They haven't established safe paths to food. And frankly, it's illegal. It doesn't help our native wildlife populations, particularly if they're moving things like rats that are not native to the system. But even with voles that are native, frankly, your neighbors don't want them, and they probably aren't going to do well. We also open a vacuum essentially for dispersing juveniles of the year who are looking for an open opportunity to set up their own housekeeping. So when we say reducing populations, that needs to be humane but lethal. Now, in the next sections, you're going to notice a couple asterisks here. Right off the bat by the word trap. Note that trapping wild animals or even non-native invasives in some cases in some states is not feasible because it's not allowed by law. Okay. So I am not telling you to go break the law if this is not a tool available to you where you live. But for making this point, if we need to reduce the number of animals in a population in order to mitigate, reduce, prevent, or halt a conflict, then the species ecology and its behaviors, its seasonality, its habits really do form the core of understanding
Me?
how we can trap
Yeah,
effective.
I leave at like around 4:15. I got to go and do.
Um, Melanie, are we okay? I'm getting a signal that I was muted.
Yes. Yeah, you're
Okay,
good. I can
great.
hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. So species ecology and behavior really does inform our choices and options in what types of traps to use, where to put them, whether or not we need to bait them, and how we can optimize our effectiveness in attempting to reduce that population. For voles, depending on where you are in the country and what species you're dealing with, in some cases, flood irrigation in an agricultural setting, especially or a larger tract, can be an option. This is an option we don't get to consider here in Western Oregon with the gray-tailed vole because frankly, our ecosystem here is one of a broad, low incline, frequently flooding river system as the Willamette Valley flows from south to north towards the Columbia. So the voles that evolved here are endemic species, does very well with flooding. They are notable for swimming. They can even maintain somehow their territoriality over certain burrow entrances. If you trap a vole and put it down the wrong flooded hole, the owner of that hole will come out hot chasing it, and then it will plunge down another flooded hole. So, but in some places, flood irrigation of a field can be very effective against some species to temporarily set back that population. Crop rotation and thinking about lowering that carrying capacity, switching to something that the voles do not eat. So an option here right now that's being tried are things like oats as opposed to grass being grown for seed. Other people try radishes. I'm going to talk later if we get to that point about some alternatives that we're thinking about experimentally, things like meadow foam that produce oil and are said to be very irritant producing for herbivores. In some cases, field burning to remove that hiding cover, not necessarily to directly kill the animals themselves, but to remove the cover so that natural predation and other methods such as disking or tilling can remove some animals and can remove the structure and thus reduce the harborage for those animals. I mentioned traps. Here's a picture below from one of our vole projects. We trap right next to active burrow systems. And we also tent our traps because those snap traps, of course, have no idea what is triggering the treadle. And in order to not trap some of our songbirds and things like that, we try to tent those. And you'll also notice that there's no bait sitting on those treadles because we are using the animals' natural pathways. They have built those runways to show us where they'll be coming in and where they will be going when they leave those burrow entrances. So that's an example of thinking about the animal's ecology for trap placement. You see in the upper right a diagram I borrowed from our colleagues in Missouri for a very standard type of PVC do-it-yourself, or you can buy these bait stations. Now, when we're thinking about toxicants or rodenticides, there are certain retail products that you can access just walking into your home and garden or farm and ranch store. And then there are those what we call restricted use pesticides that you have to go through training, usually through your state Department of Agriculture, to obtain an applicator's license at various levels. And those permits, those licenses then allow you to access certain pesticides and rodenticides that after having gotten training in their very safe use and application and PPE to use if you're potentially coming into contact with those products. And then another star, natural predation. This is something that we can think about in many phases of the vole population cycle, but certainly when they are on the loose in that hyper productive stage, all the helpers in the world have difficulty really keeping the population down. So just a reminder that even if we are using toxicants or rodenticides that we buy off the shelf in a retail setting, that the label is something that is not an optional reading. It is the law, and it tells us where we may and may not use that product. It gives us safety information for our own health and safety as well as those around us. It will talk about often the seasonality or how it can be applied. Does it have to be put in a bait box, for example, that is secure from non-target exposures? Does it have to be placed down the burrows? Is it able to be used near waterways or homes or etc.? So no matter whether you're using a retail available, a general use pesticide, or a restricted use product, the label is the law. Just like traps, the chemicals have no idea what's coming in contact with them. So it's up to us to be very, very responsible in making sure that we are fully effective in reducing, if not completely preventing, any non-target exposures. This is an example from several years ago that was addressing educating folks about lethal doses getting to animals that were not being targeted by anticoagulant products. And I want to talk, again, this is mostly focused here on Western Oregon, but for your region, you should be thinking about if you are troubled and vexed with cyclic voles, how can you potentially reduce pressure on some of these natural predators or open up opportunities for them to eat some more voles throughout the year cycle. So one group of animals that I lead off here because they're probably socially one of the groups that most people don't feel super comfortable about encouraging are snakes. And I will fully admit that I am one of those people that has some lingering childhood concerns about snakes, but they are fascinating, incredibly efficient predators, including on all life stages of the voles that we're here to talk about today. And they go down burrows very well. And frankly, our great effects as ecosystem engineers ourselves has inadvertently reduced the habitat opportunities and access opportunities for these species. They require areas to warm themselves. They require places that are safe and temperate because they don't thermoregulate the way we do to make it through the winter. And this is an example from a Landscaping for Wildlife publication about some of the really simple things that we can construct to help extend habitat back into the areas where we are being troubled by things like voles. There are hosts of predators who love snacking on voles. throughout the year, but particularly during their own reproductive seasons. Ranging from the great blue herons, they may seem like they're not doing much when they're standing out there in your field or along a waterway, but they are mighty predators. The ones that get a little bit more good press more often are things like hawks and owls. Now, making greater opportunities for these animals can be tricky. It's definitely a feasibility issue. Some of these species do need perches, and some of them would really benefit from simply being afforded a cavity where we have reduced the amount of rotting trees that would otherwise produce nest cavities for things like some of these owls. So there's some great plans for either putting perches or being very thoughtful. Certainly, everybody I know here in Western Oregon wants a barn owl pair because they're so famous for eating so many voles, particularly during the owl's breeding season. But we also have a lot of great horned owls. And where we have great horned owls, we know that no matter how many barn nest boxes we put up, we are not likely to successfully recruit a pair of barn owls because the great horned owls prey on the barn owls when they have the opportunity. So we need to, again, think not just about our target species, but also the community of species in which they're living in our area. We also have some other mammalian predators who would love to eat our voles. Some of these tend to be persecuted in our settings, particularly where we have pets or small livestock involved. But if they can be allowed in, they will certainly do their part to eat many voles. I will make just one quick aside here that sometimes I hear people bragging about how many cats they've released in order to, quote, manage their voles. Will a cat kill a vole? Certainly, if the cat is so inclined. But the downside, downstream effects of our cats, as delightful as they are as pets and companions, they are not native to the systems in which we're living here in the Americas, and they really wreak havoc on our natural native wildlife systems in many, many ways. That would be a whole other webinar, but I will just beg you to not think that simply releasing domesticated or feral domestic cats on the landscape will be a solution to a vole management puzzle. All right, in the little bit of time I've got left, I want to talk about some projects that I and collaborators have done or that we're working on now. This is a picture from one project that in which we employed our canines, our scent-trained canines, to help us find voles so that we could be more optimal in placing our traps for gray-tailed voles. As you can see, a very dense cover situation in a grass seed field. Now, one of the tricky things about discovering more and better ways to not just manage the vole populations themselves, but also anticipate when problems might be coming is a very human one. And these green arrows are the places within a vole cycle where we really ought to be making observations and noting all the different factors, the welfare factors such as amount of food and cover, the relative abundance or paucity of competitors, diseases, parasites, predators, things like that. But you know what gets everyone's attention is the peak. And it's usually after that peak with the big red arrow that we're able to make the argument for getting funding to begin research. And then it's virtually a Murphy's Law of working on vole research that as soon as you get funds and resources to do a project or an experimental trial, is the population will go into a crash, and then it's virtually impossible to get sufficient data and people on the ground to do the work. So ideally, this is just a conceptual, I mentioned this earlier. Ideally, when the population is low and before reproduction starts in earnest, whether this is on an annual cycle or in the low phase of the broader population cycle, we want to essentially start removals when it's low. The problem being that when you're working in a low population cycle is there are very few voles, but at least in our setting with the species we work on, there are virtually millions of holes that have outlived the voles that made them. So if we are going to bait, we are going to try fumigants, we are going to set traps, then knowing how to use one's time to be effective is daunting, which is part of why people don't even try at that stage. So our idea, although we didn't intend to hit a crash phase, was to use the power of dogs' olfaction to tell us which hole the vole was at right at that moment. And so this was the main name of the project that was fortunately, and thank you, we have great appreciation for the support we got from Western SARE to do this research. And this is an example of what we see on the ground when we blow vegetable smoke in just one hole. You see the little patches of burlap with all of the holes from which the smoke emerged after just seconds. And then some examples of very fresh scat near either entrances or just out in the runways that I would have to use as an unassisted trapper to try to know where to set my vole traps. So this is an example of one of our search teams working. I'll let you watch Dr. Susie Dunham and her dog Reacher in part of their time. Susie is a wildlife professional and faculty here at OSU, and in her other time, she and Reacher actually do professional wildlife conservation detection work. Our little project hit some bumps, including finding out that our captive voles had leptospirosis. We hit a crash phase in the population, and we were limited in just how much experimental work we could do, which sought to compare the effectiveness of an unaided human in trapping voles in terms of search time and animals caught per trap set versus a trapper such as Susie, who's being assisted in placing those traps. And what we learned was that dogs rule in terms of making that search and placement decision process very much more efficient. Where we would need to do more work is to learn more about what the voles are doing, especially in that low population phase when a predator comes and sniffs at the hole, as well as the movement of scent in that very complex below ground situation. And what we're doing right now is summarizing and getting ready to publish the outcomes of biomass in a pasture where there were trapped and untrapped plots. So that will be forthcoming. This is just a visual for some of the projects in which I've been involved and my colleagues and I are still involved. I mentioned the leptospirosis discovery among some of our study animals on which we were scent training the dogs. I have colleagues over in the Vet Med College who are, in fact, looking at the landscape of leptospirosis across species, including voles. I mentioned the canine assisted trapping project. The survey is nicknamed Mapping the Conflict, trying to understand how voles are affecting different crop types across the geography of the broad and long Willamette Valley. And then I'll talk just very briefly about some of our ongoing work. One is nicknamed the Vole Patrol, and that is the quest to identify those inflection points in population changes that can herald the fact that a big year or a bad year is coming, giving farmers and potentially homeowners a little bit of a warning, some greater predictability in their business environment. That if you know that the voles are about to erupt, you would certainly make different choices about investing in new stock or seed or management of an area. Up till now, and still, getting an accurate count or estimate of how many voles are in an area is a very resource and human time, labor intensive effort. And it's not something that's sustainable over the long term. Therefore, we are looking for non-invasive methods. Two of our current candidates, and there will be more, are in the video. You can see to the upper right, if you watch really carefully, I know at the scale it's hard to see, but using forward-looking infrared mounted on a drone is one way that we are developing to estimate number of voles in a given area without having to drive out on those really wet fields. So we're continuing to work. You can see at the bottom just a few of the colleagues involved in this work. We're also working with other colleagues here in my department, the EPS lab, to determine whether we can identify voles not only to species but to individual from individual scats. That being another potential non-invasive tool or approach we might test for feasibility to be able to give us that frequent sampling of the vole numbers and trend to try to identify the inflection points and thus lead to an early warning system. I mentioned looking for uh, types of crops that might either block or slow or reduce carrying capacity that could save the interior field from vole incursions or damage levels. So that is something we'll be doing this year, testing whether meadow foam and potentially mint, which is another candidate that farmers have suggested from anecdotal experience, thinking about is it effective in changing or reducing travel or herbivory by the voles in a vulnerable agricultural landscape, and then the details of what would be the effective width. Could it be intercropped? For example, we have some very high value vineyards here. Is this something that you could do between rows or between rows of hazelnuts? Things like that. And then one of our major crops here is grass grown for seed. And the little vexing voles preferentially log the seed tillers virtually days, sometimes hours before the valuable seed can be harvested. Christy Tanner and I, just to try out the method, put some essentially trail cams out just to see whether we could figure out the fine focus needs. And right off the bat, we got somebody guilty of logging seed tillers. So this information is helping us think about how we might identify the timing, potentially think about false signals that could be applied at a tactical time to dissuade the animals from doing that behavior. And then finally, we are working with colleagues in the vet college to immortalize the brain cells of reproducing female voles to begin trials with intraspecific hormone regulations and looking at candidates for that quest. Finally, we are building capacity here at OSU. This is an aerial shot of a former set of replicated subpopulations that is no longer in place, but Dr. Josh Twining has recently joined our unit here as a faculty member and is seeking funds to rebuild a new and better what we used to call Rancho Vol so that we can do replicated experiments. We have been reaching out and building multi-stakeholder communities here in the Willamette Valley. And what I would like to end with today is appealing to anyone who would like to write to me so that you might join with us across states. I know a lot of us are doing research and management trials with our stakeholders, and we probably should be thinking about how can we pool resources, especially in these times, to be more effective in managing these cyclic voles. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. The weasel is taking over, and I'm just about out of time, but thank you for your time joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dana, for sharing all that information. We do just have two questions in chat if you want to stick around and answer those. Before that, I will say I got a question on if the recording will be available to everyone, and the answer is yes. I will be sending out the recording, the slides, contact information, and any other resources that were shared out to everyone in the email. So you'll be looking for that this week. So the first question I see is there an easy way for a homeowner to determine if holes, trails in their yard is a vole versus something else?
Are there easy ways? Well, probably. I mean, the easiest is to assess the size of the hole and the setting. Look for other signs. In that one slide, I had pictures of the very, very fresh droppings. If you can determine whether those look like vole droppings as opposed to mouse droppings that tend to be smaller, darker, slightly different sized. And if you have doubts, talking to your local extension is going to be really, really helpful because they likely are very familiar with what types of burrowers you have in your neighborhood, in your area, to help narrow down the candidates. And sometimes we have to resort to, if we have a hole where the sizes are kind of on the border between different species and we don't see other obvious signs, we might resort to a game camera just to narrow down who is coming in and out of those holes. Was there another question you wanted me to take, Melanie?
Great. Yes. And Victoria asked, determine optimal moon. How does the moon affect vole population, the light, anything else?
Oh, I don't think I was referring to optimal moon. I called it moonshot because the hormonal clues that we're looking for were so far from having a definitive answer as to whether product we might be able to extract from the animals or synthesize, that it's down the road a ways. We expected, I will say though, with the FLIR, the forward-looking infrared work, we expected to see some moon phase differences in how often the animals would move around because of all those predators that are out there. And we would expect that they would be more likely to move In the dark of the moon, I'm not sure that that held up, but though again, that was on very, very limited, literally piloted data. So, right.
Those are all the questions that I see. There was a comment just in chat. If you're fortunate enough to live in an area where public libraries have a library of things, trail cams are often something they can lend.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. Wonderful. Yeah, and you can see from the videos that I shared, there are ways that we can change the focal length of those trail cameras. But even without that, and essentially just tying them to a stake to make sure they wouldn't get bumped over, we still were able to get certainly species ID on multiple species that way. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Are we at time?
Yes, we're right at time. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you guys next week.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dave.